Welcome to the Advance Your Art podcast, where we talk about the journey from artist to entrepreneur and everything in between. You've worked hard to hone your craft. Now take it to the next level with tips, techniques, strategies, and routines used by successful artists to grow their businesses and careers. Now, let's get started and have some fun with your host, Yuri Cataldo.
Well, hello, Mary. Welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
I am doing tremendously well. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming back. You are the second person who has returned to the show, so thank you so much for that.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. So, so for the listeners who are interested in hearing more about Mary's background, which we're not going to get into in depth, Mary and I chatted last on episode 88, which was released on May 18th, so they can refer back to that one. But just briefly, because I want to see if this has changed any, how do you describe yourself and what you do?
Well, I don't remember what I told you last time. Whenever someone asks me that, I usually just make something up on the fly. So
Perfect.
What I'm going to say is I feel like I'm really stepping into a space where my role is helping people find the courage to create some pretty powerful outcomes in their life, either through understanding how to deeper connect with people or desires, or through their communication.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So I do want to actually ask you a lot about communication, but before we do that, when we last spoke, you were headed to this amazing trip in Peru where you're gonna take a bunch of ayahuasca and see what happens. And so, if you're okay with chatting about that, how did that experience go, and how have things evolved since then?
So I'm totally cool with chatting about ayahuasca, but I'll warn you that it's so much that we could easily spend the entire show talking about that.
Okay.
But I'm not kidding, because it was literally. It was literally probably the single most transformative thing that I've ever done in my life. And I'm not saying that because I want people to go out and run out and do this, because it's certainly not for everybody. But for me, and of course, people can go listen on episode 88, but I've got a lot of trauma in my background. And certainly, what I've learned is that trauma is stored in our bodies. Our bodies are like a library, and it's storing these things that have happened to us. And if we don't process the traumas as they're happening, they can get stuck. And that stuckness, that's my scientific word, that stuckness sort of frames how we perceive our world. And so if we're seeing the world through a lens of trauma, that's going to create a set of certain behavior patterns that is, over time creates your personality and your outlook and even your day-to-day, the way that you take action in the world. So one of the big things that I learned, because, someone like me, I've already created a lot of success. I'm not living in a world filled with problem, right? I've got things pretty much under control. But what I realized that what was the driving force behind a lot of the successes that I've had in my life actually comes from a foundation of fear. And
how so?
It was super eye-opening. How can I explain this? It's like you just gain an awareness. So, through one of the ceremonies that I was having with the ayahuasca, there was just a gained awareness that this was true. So it's been more than 6 months now. It's not like I was shown a vision of fear, but that there's somehow some connection made in your subconscious that I was very aware that my drive in life is fear-based. And I think I've heard other people say that fear is not the enemy. Fear can be very motivating, but I think that mine was maybe to an unhealthy level. And so since that time, I've been doing a lot of work, meditation, especially, and I can feel at times that fear actually releasing from my body. And that's kind of a wild concept to wrap your mind around. But for me, it's been very true. And my outlook and my level of awareness on things is increased. It's almost like my consciousness level is expanding as that fear is decreasing.
Oh, that's very interesting. I've heard that before from other people, and I think that's true, that there is a healthy level of fear, because if everybody wasn't afraid, we'd all be, well, psychopaths and just, doing things that are physically impossible and destroying our lives. So fear can help you push forward. So I'm curious on that. So I've done some trauma healing type of things before. I don't remember if we talked about this off or on podcast, but I didn't do it with ayahuasca, which your experience sounds a lot more interesting, especially in Peru. I did it with a group of people around me, and it was finding ways to dig into your self-conscious in a group way, but also thinking past or thinking to your past traumas that have happened in your childhood or other times, and finding your real motivations for things. And for me, part of some of my entrepreneurial success was kind of a fear, but it was more of it was the scarcity thing of, I need to show people that I can do it and that I'm good, and I had to prove it versus I guess already living that you're a good person doing well.
It's kind of showing the world, and whoever that represented in your life, but that needing to be enough.
Yes, exactly. You've always have to prove that you're enough, because you're never enough for yourself.
Right. And it is kind of interesting, because you are proving it to yourself. I definitely went something similar when my book came out, and, a few weeks later, it's #1 on Amazon. And I remember having lunch and not even comprehending the fact that my staff was wanting to celebrate that my book was #1, and I'm just kind of moving on to the next thing that I want to conquer.
Yeah.
And it's when is it ever going to be enough? Yeah. When are you ever going to be enough? And then what I learned through this healing experience is that for me, this went so far back into my background. It literally went to the place from when I was born. Because when I was born, I was not born to a single mother, but my father was in the Navy, and so he was out on a submarine, nuclear engineer, and my mother was very unstable. And so I had this feeling of never feeling safe. As a small, from the time of being a newborn, just never feeling safe. Yeah. And so that lack of safety, that lack of stability, created a I'm just going to say imprint, because I don't necessarily have all the language down to use for this, but created a specific imprint of fear. And so a lot of my decision making was driven by fear. And now I would say that it's not an automatic thing, but over the last 6 months of integrating that experience, it feels very different. And so that's just one thing. I actually wrote out 14 major bullet points of my takeaways from ayahuasca.
Oh, wow. Have you put them in a book or podcast or article? I'm guessing you've probably done all 3.
No.
None of the above. You've done none of the above?
I posted it on Facebook somewhere, and I've got it in my journal, and I'm going to unpack it more for, especially because, and I don't know when this episode's going to air, but I'm going to be going and doing ayahuasca again, actually at Rhythmia, which is in Costa Rica, and it's all this Women's Week. So I'm super jazzed about it. So actually right now, this next month, as I'm preparing to do that, would be perfect for me to unpack those 14 things. But here, I'll give you another one.
Okay.
Okay. But this one's really trippy. Okay. All so right. You gotta promise you won't judge.
I promise not to judge.
Judge-free zone.
Exactly. Judgment-free zone.
Very good. So, a few weeks ago, maybe about 6 weeks ago now, I was driving my son to work, and he goes to the community college here, and he was just really, my son is 18 and he's on the spectrum. Now he's got like high functioning autism. So some people might refer to that as Asperger's, and he can be at times very abrasive. He's also 6'5", and when we were driving to school, he was using that time to berate me. So he's literally going like, Mom, you're so effing stupid. And, it was really harsh.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't stop. And we were enclosed in my car, which is not exactly a giant car, but still it doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
To be verbally assaulted in this way by your own son while you're trying to do something nice for him and drive him to school. So I'm feeling this real sadness of my situation welling up inside me. And I finally get to the point where I pulled the car over and I was in tears, and I got out of the car and I kind of let my head drop into my hands. And in that moment when my head dropped into my hands, I realized that every word he was saying to me was a reflection and a projection of my own inner self-talk. Now, this was a huge moment for me. Mm-hmm. Every word that was coming out of his mouth was literally a projection of my own subconscious. Mm-hmm. And so that was about 6 weeks ago, and he hasn't done it again since that day.
Wow.
Yeah. So there was something about just having, people talk about like the matrix or whatever, all these esoteric concepts, right? Mm-hmm. Well, one of those concepts is that everything is a projection. And I'm certainly no expert to talk about like we're living in a hologram, because I don't know any of that stuff.
Right.
But what I can tell you is in that moment, it was very evident to me that he was reflecting back my own feelings of myself.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's, I think Tony Robbins, I think it's him, who says that he looks at life as it's happening for him, not to him. So it was very self-aware in this moment of you to realize and to make that connection, because not everybody would make that connection. So I think that's a huge testament of the self-work that you've been doing and your own growth, realizing that a lot of the words he was saying was actually what you were projecting, from your internal monologue out. So I think that's fantastic. How have things changed since then?
Well, and I think that the real miracle is that it's not happening anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, so the moment I became aware of it, and I realized that I have more work to do. This inner work, this inner subconscious that has created neural pathways to create those beliefs about myself in the first place. Mm-hmm. That was what needed to be healed. That is what needed to unscrew itself, so to speak. But I knew I had work to do, and then I kind of pay attention in my environment and look at what books come to me. And sure enough, the perfect books come to me that might be about self-love or might be about taking space for myself, allowing myself to heal, drawing the right people into my life that I can actually even have these conversations with, because, it's not like you can just go to your average Super Bowl party and say, oh yeah, everything my son says to me is a projection from my own subconscious mind.
Right.
I mean,
it'd be a very interesting Super Bowl party.
Well,
although with last Super Bowl, it was so boring. It actually may have livened up the mood a little bit.
Well, I remember I was at the Super Bowl party a few days ago, and I don't know, my friends are drinking and they're talking about whatever. And I just said, I just can't do it anymore. I just not into this level of superficial, whatever it is. And they're looking at me like I'm a circus freak. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'm just working on expanding my mind. And in that moment, they really looked at me like I had two heads. It was so funny. Lesson learned.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned there were books that pop up at this appropriate time. Are there any books that you can think of right now that have, I guess, made their way in front of you in the last couple of months that really